Hi, I'm Dr. J. Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I check the temperature of health in the United States and around the world and give you expert insights on infectious diseases and public health. This is the weekly episode of Inside Outbreaks. On these episodes, I review the latest outbreaks of infectious diseases, the outbreaks that you need to know about. And I do this with my friend and colleague, Jon Epstein, a veterinarian, virologist, and disease ecologist who, like me, has spent his career tracking dangerous infectious diseases across all corners of the earth. Thanks, Jon, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Jay. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Did you have a good weekend?
I had a great weekend, but I tell you, man, I'm exhausted. I was out in California near San Francisco visiting a friend, and I took the red eye back to New York. So I'm literally fresh off the plane with not a whole lot of sleep on board, but
okay,
I'm going to rally. I promise. I'm going to
rally.
Okay.
Well, we'll hope you'll rally. If there's anything that can make you rally, it is a discussion about viruses, bacteria, and other microscopic organisms that make us sick. And interestingly enough, our first topic is kind of a vacation themed topic. It's cruise ships. And I wanted to highlight today a study that CDC published recently about some of the dangers of actually being on a cruise ship. This is particularly relevant and worrisome because, as some of you who are close watchers of the show may know, one of the things that CDC closed, not CDC didn't choose to close it, but one of the things that our current administration chose to close was actually CDC's vessel sanitation program, which is the program that's used by CDC to basically make sure the cruise ships are safe and free from infectious diseases. So this program, however, recently analyzed some data about outbreaks of a disease called Legionnaires Disease aboard cruise ships. And what they found is a surprising and dangerous link to hot tubs on those cruise ships. So what they did was they looked at data from November 2022 through June 2024, and they found 12 separate cases of Legionnaires disease that were on 2 separate cruise ships. 10 of those 12 cases were serious enough that the travelers had to be hospitalized. The CDC investigations found that the travelers got their infections from using a private hot tub that was attached to their rooms. I guess these were pretty fancy rooms that had an extra balcony with a private hot tub. And the study investigators wrote that these devices are subject to less stringent operating requirements than our public hot tubs. And the operating protocols were insufficient to prevent the Legionella bacteria from growing. So, Jon, what do you think about hot tubs? What do you think about cruise ships?
Well, I'm a big fan of hot tubs, but only if they're clean. And it's a real problem when there's not the same stringent cleaning protocol that they might have had in some of the more public areas. Maybe there are, hot tubs next to the swimming pools that get a lot of cleaning. But the risk here is that, Legionella can survive on surfaces, and particularly if those surfaces have moisture and they're wet. And so if these hot tubs aren't cleaned, there could be like a slime layer or some kind of coating that really allows the bacteria to remain. And then what happens, I'd imagine is this is usually a respiratory disease that you can get from mist of moisture. So if you're in the hot tub and it's churning and bubbling, it could create a mist. And if there's bacteria on the surface of that hot tub, I imagine that's one way that someone could have gotten infected.
Yeah, no, Jon, you're exactly right. I mean, what you're referring to, that sort of layer of the surface, is referred to, as a biofilm, right? This sort of slimy layer in which this bacteria has a unique way of surviving in those biofilms. And exactly as you pointed out, the reason we worry about Legionnaires disease is that it causes a pneumonia, which is just an infection of the lungs, but it's a very severe infection of the lungs. And, it was originally found in the late 1970s at a convention of Legionnaires, basically, former military people who gathered together as part of the American Legion. And there was an outbreak at a hotel, and that outbreak was traced to some abnormality in the heating and cooling system, so that this mist of the air conditioning system was letting out particles that actually had the bacteria in it. And that's exactly what happens in these hot tubs. And if you inhale this bacteria, you're at risk of getting a very severe pneumonia that can be treated with antibiotics, but oftentimes it gets missed because, people think that they have just a regular cold or a virus infection, when in fact it's this unusual and dangerous bacteria called Legionnaires disease.
Yeah, and this is another instance where it's so important to be able to trace this back to the point of infection. And we talked about cruise ships previously. They can be, an area where foodborne illness can be an issue sometimes. But if you didn't have reporting and, astute clinicians picking up on what this was and the history of the cruise, they might not be able to trace it back to the actual cruise ship, particularly because there's other ways people might get a pneumonia. But once they identify it as Legionella, I think that probably narrows it down, doesn't it, to certain environments?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges with this disease is exactly what you started with, which is the diagnosis problem. A lot of people will get sick, they'll get this infection, and they may not know that they have it because it doesn't show up on like the normal tests that you would do for this type of disease, which is you might collect a sample of the patient's sputum, what's in their lungs, and try to grow it. This doesn't grow very well in that test. You might also try to take a sample of their blood and try to grow the bacteria from their blood. Unfortunately, that doesn't really work for this bacteria. Yeah. What actually works really well, interestingly, is a test of your urine. You actually can pee out what's called the antigen or the protein on the surface. And that tends to be a very reliable test, unless you do a specific test for what's called Legionella culture, where you try to specifically grow and look for this type of bacteria. Now, the upside, of course, is that it is actually highly treatable. If you use a standard antibiotic, what we call macrolide antibiotics like azithromycin or a Z-Pak, it can work really well at treating this. And the other good thing about this disease is that most people who have a very otherwise normally healthy with no other pre-existing diseases tend to recover quite well. But it really does cause severe illness in people who may have some underlying immune condition or tend to be older in life. And of course, we know that a lot of people who go on cruise ships tend to be people who are retirees, right?
Yeah, right. So they might be particularly vulnerable. So it's hard because you don't know in advance how clean a surface may be, or you assume that it's being cleaned regularly. But now that we're aware of this, it's a good idea if you're going on a cruise to really inquire about the cleaning regimen. Make sure if you have something like a hot tub or a spa-sized bath or something in your room, that you really understand that it has been thoroughly cleaned before you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things that I think are worth highlighting here. So if you are somebody that goes on a cruise ship, it's perfectly reasonable for you to go ahead and ask some questions. Ask, what were the recent health inspections like for the hot tubs, particularly if you're lucky enough to have a hot tub that's attached to your room. And specifically, you want to ask things about, are their disinfectant levels being checked? Is the pH level being checked? And are there some standard maintenance activities being performed? That means daily scrubbing down of the slime or biofilm layer that can accumulate on tubs. Is the hot tub water filtered according to recommendations made by the manufacturer? And is the water replaced on a standard and regular scale? And the other thing people can do is you can actually buy test strips. If you go to like a pool supply store or a big hardware store, they can actually give you test strips where you can check for the chlorine levels, the bromine levels, and the pH levels. And those are three important things that you can take kind of your own health into your hands and check if you're going to a hot tub. Is the chlorine level accurate? Is the bromine level accurate? And is the pH accurate? Or at the safe level, let's say. And if it's at those safe levels, you're more likely to be able to say that, oh, this is an experience I can enjoy without worrying about breathing in a mist that may contain this dangerous bacteria.
Yeah, well, I'm going to make a note of that. PhD. See, that's the jet lag. Exactly. pH levels and bromine. I mean, it really is something to have in your back pocket if you're going into a place where there's any kind of public water, really, pools, hot tubs, etc. So
exactly, yeah, and it's not something that I have to be honest. It's something I normally ever worry about. I mean, I've investigated very large outbreaks of Legionnaires disease. There was a huge outbreak in New York in the mid 2010s. That was associated with a different source, what we call cooling towers. And these are systems that are part of the heating, ventilation, air conditioning system of large buildings. And they're used essentially to dissipate the heat that's generated, in an air conditioning system. And unfortunately, when the water in those systems gets heated up, it tends to evaporate. And if there are bacteria in those cooling towers, you get the exact same problem. But instead of people just like right around inside the hot tub getting sick, this bacteria spreads throughout a community. And so, so I've always been, aware and worried about sort of cooling towers. And I've known the risk of hot tubs, but it hasn't something I've worried about before. But I do think that if I have friends or family going on cruise ships, it's the type of thing I would advise people to, at least at a minimum, ask the cruise ship about, because those types of reminders can make sure they're doing the things to keep you safe.
Look, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was going to bring something up too. This is going to be completely anecdotal. So I'm going to preface this with, this is not anything that I tested or from a study, but I've done a fair bit of traveling in different parts of the world. And sometimes you find yourself in hotel rooms that have an air conditioning unit, a unit that might be on the wall, just serving that one room. And I make a habit, if I can, of removing the grill and checking the condensation unit underneath. And I have at times found that it's very unclean. You get that kind of biofilm layer sometimes accumulating because there's constant condensation on that surface. So that's another thing I've noticed, where there's, there could be moisture chronically on that surface, and a great place for bacteria to accumulate and grow. And this is a ventilation unit that, is blowing air into the room. So listening to you talk about cooling towers reminded me that it's on my own personal checklist. If I go into a hotel room with a single kind of in-wall air conditioning unit, just to check the condensation vents and see that they're clean as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, as you and I know, like, the environment around us is a big determinant of our own health. And, I've done a lot of talks about indoor air quality, and this is a component of it, right? And I acknowledge I'm guilty of it too. Like we have air filters in our home. I don't check and replace them as often as I should. Often by the time I'm replacing them, they're already pretty dirty. And these are the types of things that, I even myself need to work on being in a better habit and making sure that I'm checking all of it at the same time.
It's good. The indoor environment's tricky. And to the extent that we can control, checking filters, checking vents when you have central AC, or even in wall or in window AC units, making sure you do clean off the air filters and vents pretty regularly, because it protects your health.
Yep, absolutely. And so let's switch a little bit to another aspect of places in which environmental contamination can lead to a dangerous infection. And this is a bacteria called Listeria. And very similar to Legionnaires, Listeria has an ability to survive on and thrive on certain surfaces and not get picked up until it's too late and deadly. And so I want to highlight here 2 outbreaks that CDC has recently done some reporting about. As of May 16th, the CDC and FDA reported that there are 42 people across the country who have been sickened by Listeria. And of those 42 people, 41 were hospitalized and 14 of them died. CDC, it turns out, began investigating an outbreak of illnesses among residents of long-term care facilities, places like nursing homes, in 2018, but couldn't find a cause. But in the end of 2024, they detected 6 new illnesses that had the same type of Listeria strain, and they reopened the investigation. And it was just discovered just a few months ago that there was a frozen supplement shake. So, the types of shakes that elderly people get when they're having trouble with their nutrition.
Nutrition shake, yeah.
Exactly, that contained this outbreak strain. And so they were finally able to link these cases together. There were human cases occurring out there, and there was a sample taken from a food manufacturer that makes these supplement shakes. And it turns out that it's kind of like matching a fingerprint, right? The fingerprint that was causing people to get of the disease that was causing people to get sick was the same one in the supplement shakes.
Yeah. I had to look this up, Jay, because when I saw we were going to be talking about these Listeria outbreaks, I wanted to know what the annual number of cases are in America and how common a disease this is. And it's interesting because here again, the CDC has a routine surveillance system for Listeria called the Listeria Initiative. And this is a reportable disease. And they have measured that or detected about 1,600 illnesses each year in the United States that are linked to Listeria infections. 1,500 of them result in hospitalization, and 260 result in death. So it can be a really serious infection, and it's good that we have a surveillance system for it, because it can show up in different food items. And if we're not paying attention, then again, we get these clusters of cases and don't know where they came from.
Yeah, Listeria is an infection that I spent a lot of time working on during my first 2 years at CDC when I was in the what's called Foodborne and Diarrheal Diseases group. And in that group, this was one of the initiatives, was trying to actually get people to care more about this infection. Because while it is not very common, like Legionella, it tends to hurt people who already have some type of pre-existing immune system problem. And when it hurts them, it actually leads to severe illness and death. So a lot of diseases that we get from contaminated foods, things like salmonella, things like E. coli, they cause a lot of discomfort, but they tend to not kill people. But Listeria, unfortunately, is one of those. And it also has, unfortunately, a predilection for women who are pregnant and can both hurt them severely and result in the death of their fetus. And the reason we worry about it so much is one, because it is so, sickening and deadly, but the second is because it gets into foods of all different types. And let me highlight for you the second outbreak that was part of this group that CDC is recently investigating. So this first one was traced to, supplement protein shakes that a lot of people who are elderly might need to drink. The second one was tied to like pre-prepared sandwiches. So, you just got back from an overnight trip. There have been plenty of times when I've had a long road trip and stopped at a mini mart next to a gas station, or bought something really quickly at an airport. That's one of those just like prepackaged sandwiches, because I just needed something super quick to eat and I needed some nutrition. So this was actually traced to a company called Fresh and Ready Foods in San Fernando, California, that was selling those type of pre-prepared sandwiches in Arizona, California, Nevada, and Washington State. And it turns out that they found a sample from the environmental samples at the place that these foods are made that matched a bunch of cases, 10 cases of people who'd been sickened and hospitalized from Listeria. So there's now been a massive recall of these kind of pre-prepared sandwiches. So, and again, the reason this is so worrisome is because this Listeria, just like we talked about with Legionella, can find its way onto surfaces. And once it's on the surface of a food manufacturing facility, it's hard to get rid of unless you really scrub it and sanitize those surfaces well.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember, because there's a risk, because when we highlight these things, people may think this happens all the time and they might be afraid to eat prepackaged food or, these types of sandwiches. We should just say that, in general, food is safe in the United States. It's one of the amazing things about this country is we have really good food supply chains and food safety standards. This is why it's so important to have organizations within the US government that are looking out for food safety. And when a problem is identified, most companies will voluntarily recall the items that are found to be contaminated or affected, and they will take steps to rectify the situation. So you never want anyone to get sick, but generally the response is pretty responsible in terms of making sure that the contaminated food items are taken out of the market supply chain.
Yeah, and we've highlighted several times, over the past few months, the concerns that we both have about the cuts that are being made to infectious disease control programs around the country. And I'll just highlight again, our food safety system isn't something that just exists and you build it and leave it and walk away and it's there. It is a complex system that is built of many different humans across many different places. Everything from, your doctor's office ordering a test on you that gets sent to a lab, to going to a public health laboratory that does some type of specialized testing, what we call genomic sequencing on it, to people inspecting factories and inspecting foods and taking samples there, also uploading data about the specimens they find. Right. And then people at CDC, FDA, and USDA actually sitting at desks and trying to compare those strains. I mean, this is a lot of manual work that they can't really always be replaced by, say, computers or something else like that. That unfortunately several of these programs have been sort of chipped away at recently. And if we want our food to remain safe, as you highlight, Jon, the only way to do that is to pay for all of the different aspects of the system that allow our investigators, in these federal agencies, to piece together what's a really complicated puzzle. Like, how do you match together one person who gets sick in one state to one person who gets sick in another? It's not as obvious as people might sort of intuitively believe.
I know. And you're absolutely right. And not only do we have to value and sustain these parts of the government that look out for food safety, but there's crossover elements. And it tease a little bit the segment we're going to get into on bird flu. But as we're seeing, even pet food supply chains and pet food safety can affect animal health. We're seeing, instances of raw cat food diets that have, material in there that is still infectious, right? H5N1, and cats getting infected that way. Again, we need surveillance infrastructure to detect these cases, trace them back, and make those connections to, factories and suppliers of different types of food. So it's true in the pet industry too.
Yeah, without question. And I think this really kind of like highlights a message that we hope that all of our viewers absorb and understand, that if you do care about public health and care about the sort of public safety components of the work that we do in public health, make your voice heard and make sure your legislators know how much you care about keeping up the funding to these places, because it doesn't sound like really sexy work, like, oh, this is a lab that, tests food specimens, or these are the people that go and swab cruise ships. But it turns out there are so many different layers that we all need to basically live the productive lives we want to live.
Yeah, it's not sexy, Jay. Raging diarrhea or severe pneumonia. we all want to stay healthy. So let's keep those people doing their unsexy job that's so vital to our own health.
Absolutely. All right, Jon, anything else you wanted to go over this week, or you think we covered all the sexy topics?
I think we definitely covered, our bacterial stuff for this week. I learned a lot too. So it was good today.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. If you enjoyed this episode and you enjoy learning about public health and infectious diseases as much as we do, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Please share this episode with any friends or colleagues in your life. And we look forward to seeing you here next week for another episode of Inside Outbreaks on Thermometer. Thank you all.